lesson, which is going to be talking about complex numbers and imaginary numbers. And so we're going to start off with talking about what is an imaginary number. An imaginary number is the square root of -1, and it's just represented as I. So we're going to be having it's imaginary if we're taking the square root of a -1. Up to this point, we've talked about that you can't take the square root of -1. What ended up happening is, so we could work with these numbers, we started working with them in the imaginary world. And so I represents that imaginary number. And so to be able to work with these, we're going to be working with square roots. And so when we're working with this perfect square roots, we're going to be talking about just having this chart again. We did this chart in the fall. We'll be using it again. And so remember, the square root of 4 is 2, square root of 9, 3, and so forth. So make sure you have all the first 20 written down. Having these written down will be the most beneficial to have them memorized, or at least where you can recognize that it's probably one of these. It saves you some time. So now, let's take the first one we have. And so we have the square root of a -36. So this negative is going to be, remember we're talking about the square root of a negative is I. So we're going to bring that out as I. It's going to come at the end of the number that we're writing. Now we're going to simplify the 36, because we can separate these apart. So the square root of 36 is 6. So our answer is 6I. Let's take it a little bit further. Let's say there's some other operations in front of the square root. They get brought down just like they are. So we have this negative in front of the square root. We write the negative just like it is. Now let's start looking at simplifying the square root. The negative inside the radical comes out as an I. And now we're going to simplify that 225. 225, the square root of that is 15. So 15. Our answer is -15I. But not always can your square root be a perfect square. So we're going to kind of treat this one similar to what we just did, but we're just going to have to add one more step. So start off with the things on the outside of the radical get brought down, so the negative sign gets brought down. Now I know I have a negative underneath my radical, so that means I have an I. Now let's simplify what's left of my square root. Oops, let's start doing 24. And so what's left of the inside that square root is square root of 24. Well, that 24 wasn't on my perfect squares list. Remember, that list was 4, and then we had 9, and so forth. And so I need to think about, is there any of these perfect squares that's an even factor, or is a factor of that square root of 24? Well, 4 can divide in. So the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. The square root of 4 is 2. Now I'll look at square root of 6. Is there any perfect squares that can divide into that? And the answer is no. So square root of 6. So that comes over here and I write it in. And that whole thing is the answer. So now, let's practice another one. So we have the square root of 250. So there's nothing on the outside, so I don't have anything to worry about there. But I do have this negative underneath the radical. So Since we're dealing with square roots, that's going to come out as an I. Now, let's look at simplifying the square root of 250. And so I go to my perfect squares list. And I go, is 4 a factor? No. Is 9 a factor? No. Is 16 a factor? No. Is 25 a factor? Yes. And so we have the square root of 25 times 10. Square root of 25 is 5 times the square root of 10. And so that's what's written in front of my imaginary. That's our imaginary solution. Now let's look at this one. We're going to have other operations involved. So the other operations, to start with, just get brought down. We will talk about these later on and what we can do with things like this. But for right now, we're just dropping them down. There's nothing more we can do with them at this state. Now, I'm looking at simplifying my square root of negative 90. The negative becomes the I. Now let's simplify the square root of 90. And so I look at my perfect squares list. 4 won't work. 9 does. So square root of 9 times square root of 10. Now, if I look at my list, 10 is not one of my perfect squares and nothing that will divide into it. So that gives me 3 square roots of 10. Is that simplified? So 3 square roots of 10. And this whole thing is your answer. So 15 minus 3 square roots of 10, I. And so then I haven't pointed out that square root ends before the letter I. The I is after the square root. So let's do one more of these. And then we're going to look at something else. So we have, just like before, we have some operations in front. These just get brought down. So negative 7 minus our imaginary number. Okay? We take the negative, and it becomes the I because it's underneath the square root. And now we're going to try to simplify the square root of 55. So I go to my perfect squares list. 4 doesn't work. Next number up is 9. It's not a factor. 16 is not a factor. 25 is not a factor. 36 is not a factor. 49 is not a factor. And the next one up is 64, which is too big. So I know I can't go here. So that means this is as simplified as it can get. So we have square root of 55, I. And so our answer is negative 7 minus the square root of 55, I. Next thing we're going to work with is we're going to talk about I having a power on it. So far, all we've really done was this first one. We did the I to the first power, and that's just simply I. And so remember, I is equal to the square root of negative 1. That's going to help us if we go through the next steps. So I squared is square root of negative 1 squared. So these two cancel out, leaving our answer as just negative 1. So I cubed is I squared times I. And so we found out I squared is negative 1, and I is just I. So it's negative I. I to the fourth is I squared times I squared. So -1 times -1, which is just +1. What's neat about this circle or this cycle is it keeps repeating as the powers go up. So I to the 5th, I to the 6th, I to the 7th, I to the 8th, oops. And it keeps following this pattern as we go around. And so instead of us having to figure out how many times we're looking at a number, if I have like I to the 715th, I need to figure out how I can quickly get there. So the easiest way I have found to simplify them, there's lots of different ways you'll see, is with this chart. If the power happens to be even, then all you do is take that power, oops, you're going to take your power and divide it by 2. If that number that comes out of that is even, the answer is 1. If it's odd, it's going to be -1. And that's your answer. But on the other hand, let's say that power was odd. We're going to take that power, and we first have to subtract 1. Then we're going to take that answer and divide by 2. These are all going to have an I with it. It's either going to be, if it's even, +I. If it's odd, -I. And that's all your answer is for that number I to a power. If there's other things around it, you may have to do more steps, but you're simply going to start there. So let's look at this 92. So we're going to take our power. Our power is 92. It's even, so all I'm going to do is divide it by 2. So when I divide 92 by 2, I end up with 46. So this number is even, and so my answer is simply 1. Let's do this next one. This one's, my power is odd, so that means I need to take 123 and subtract 1 first, giving us 122. I'm going to divide that by 2, give me 61. This answer is odd. So it's already odd to begin with, so that means I'm going to have an I in my answer. I just need to decide if it's even or odd, or if it's positive or negative. And because this is odd, it's going to be negative. So -I. Let's do a few more of these. But we're going to add in some other operations. So like before, things that are more, things that are extra are just going to get brought down. So we had -5 times our I. So we're going to take our power. It's even. So all I have to do is divide by 2. So 360 divided by 2. And that gives me 180, which is even. And so that's going to be a 1 that gets brought over here. So my final answer, -5 times 1 is -5. Let's look at this next one. We again have an operation in front. We have 8 times. And now we're going to take and look at the power. It's odd. So that means we're going to have an I. We're either going to have a positive I or a negative I. So 243 minus 1 equals 242. I'm going to divide that by 2. Gives me 121. And this is odd. And since that's odd, it's negative. 8 times a negative I gives me a final answer of negative 8I. So now let's look at, what if the power is, instead of being positive, is a negative? What do I do then? Well, that chart will work to simplify positive powers, but it doesn't help us as much with negative. We have to go backwards, and the easiest way to do it is with this. This is the math that we'll be doing as we go through the process. And so, first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our number that we had. So we had, in this case, negative 53. So we're negative, so it means we're going to have to do some extra work. We're going to take negative 53 and we're going to divide it by 4. And so when we do that, we end up with a negative 13.25. We're always going to take this number and round up. So that gives us negative 14. And so when we multiply negative 14 times 4, we end up with a negative 56. So that negative 656 comes down. And then we take and negative 56 plus what is negative 53? And so we would need to add 3. This information is going to come over here. So negative 56 plus 3. And remember, our rules of exponents are, when we're adding exponents, that means we can take and separate it with multiplication. So negative 56 times I to the third. This will be cancel out and become a 1. So 1 times anything we don't have to write. So we have I cubed. And based upon our chart, we know I cubed is negative 1I. So that's our answer. So whatever we have here, we come up with that 56, is really just going to cancel out. It's giving us a 1 times. This is the power that we really need to concentrate on. That's the power of I that you're really simplifying at the end of it. So let's practice a few, and these take a little bit more work, so I'm going to go ahead and give you a few more to practice with on these. So here, we're going to look at a simple one. So we have it negative, so we know we need to do this process. So we have negative 3 divided by 4, which is negative 3/4. We round that up, gives us negative 1, times 4 gives us a negative 4. Negative 4 plus what is negative 3? And that answer is 1. So we have I to the first power. Because remember, this just basically canceled out and was gone. I to the first power is I. So that's your answer. Let's practice another one. It's negative 18. We're going to go through the same process again. We're going to take, it's negative, so that means that we need to come over here and let's look at dividing it. So negative 18 divided by 4, and it's always going to be a 4 here. That number is always going to stay the same. So when we divide it by 4, we end up with a negative 4.5. Rounded up, we have negative 5. And again, we're going to have that 4 is always going to be here, because that's cycle of 4. So negative 20. Negative 20 plus what is equal to negative 18? And so that plus what is, we need to add 2. So this becomes our power on our I. I squared, going back to our chart, is negative 1. That's your answer. So now let's look at this next one. We have a negative 157. So it's odd. So I am going to take that number and I am going to lower it by 1. And so we have negative 156. Oh, wait a minute. What am I doing? We take that number and divide by 4, and we end up with a negative 39.25. And we round that up, we end up with negative 40. So that rounded up, even though it would not normally. And so we end up with times 4. And so we have a negative 60. Negative 160 plus what is equal to a negative 157? That what is a 3. So, again, remember this part doesn't need to be written down, because that's always going to become 1. So we have I cubed. I cubed was negative I off of our beginning chart. Let's do a couple more. So we have negative 170 as our exponent. So we take that negative 170, divide it by 4. Negative 170 divided by 4 is negative 42.5. We round that up to negative 43 times 4. And that gives us a negative 172. Negative 172 plus what is equal to negative 170? Well, we need to add 2 to get there. So this is I squared. I squared was negative 1. We are going to do one more together, and then I'm going to let you try the last one on your own. So let's look at the last one. So our exponent this time is a negative 552. We're going to divide that by 4. And this time it gives us a number that's even, 138. There's no decimal. That means the answer is 1. So if this ever comes out as an integer, then the answer is 1 and we don't have to go any further. Go ahead and do this last one and check your answer with the computer and start working on your homework.